I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but reviewing 2019 as it affected the entire world. But I hope you'll forgive me if I begin with here in London, because some of us are still wearing our wet clothes from Britain's general election, which had, of course, seismic consequences. Let's look on the bright side. George Soros and Tony Blair and the billionaires who've spent as much money as they thought it would take to stop Brexit from happening have lost all their money. And Britain is definitely leaving the European Union in just weeks from now. And that will have its impact on the European Union too, where in France, throughout the entirety of 2019, hundreds of thousands of French working class people have been on the streets confronting the government of President Macron and his neoliberal austerity super duper EU politics. And the chances are that that will continue. Now, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, have been joined by the massed ranks of the organized trade union movement in France. Events are likely to turn even more spectacularly ugly for the ruling elite in France. And of course, as we review 2019, we cannot avoid looking at the travails of Donald J. Trump, who began the year, he thought, coming to the end of the Russiagate scandal, only to discover that it morphed into a Ukrainegate scandal and that he's in just as deep trouble with the Congress, now controlled by the Democratic Party, his opposition. And the big question is, will he reach the presidential election in the year that is rapidly coming up? Of course, some much-loved figures like Evo Morales, the president, the legitimate president of Bolivia, have been driven into exile. But that's only because events have turned for the better in Argentina, and the Trump-like president there has been swept from office, and the Peronists are back. And we'll be looking also at what is likely to happen to you remember Juan Guaido? You remember the whole world recognizing Juan Guaido and handing over gold and sovereign wealth funds to him? No, I don't know what's happened to him either, and neither do the Venezuelan people. The situation in the Middle East goes from bad to worse, except in Syria, where at the beginning of this year, well, a lot less of Syria was controlled by the legitimate government in Damascus than is now controlled by them. Almost all of Syria is now liberated from the gigantic Western-sponsored jihadist throat-cutting army that once looked like they were capable of going all the way to power in Damascus. But elsewhere, in Iraq, even in Lebanon, there is deep-seated unrest, and the political outcome cannot easily be predicted. In Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, the conflicts in the Gulf between the various oligarchies, plutocrats, is still not settled. But, coming back to Britain, the price of getting Brexit done is that we've got to put up with Boris Johnson for, it would seem, 5 long years with a substantial parliamentary majority. But nothing is ever as good or ever as bad as it first appears. I've been doing the numbers. It turns out that the Labour vote was bad, but not that bad. The Tory vote was good, but not that good. As a matter of fact, just digest this point. Only 1 in 5 adults in Britain voted for Boris Johnson. And once Brexit's done, well, a lot of the people in a lot of the places behind what used to be called Labour's Red Wall in industrial and post-industrial Britain will be demanding a course of action from the Conservative government that will not be easy for that Conservative government to follow. So it's never over. There's no final victory and there's no final defeat. That's how I see 2019. Let's talk to our audience of distinguished experts and 1 or 2 enthusiastic amateurs like me. Well, who better to start the show than the distinguished expert on security matters, intelligence and military matters who's been with us frequently on Kalimahora over the years. Charles Shoebridge, welcome back.
Always a pleasure to be here, George, and hello to everybody else. You're absolutely right. Of course, there's no denying it's been an extremely important, eventful year, and particularly those of us that thought that with the demise of Russiagate, let's not forget Russiagate found, although a number of people, this is of course the investigation into Trump and what was supposed to be his collusion with Russia in first of all getting him to power and then him actually acting in Russia's interests, not the US interests, in pursuing his foreign and domestic policies. Of course, that inquiry was all about Russian collusion, but of course it found absolutely no evidence whatsoever of Russian collusion, notwithstanding that a number of people have been prosecuted, but of course none of them for actual collusion with Russia. And one would have expected him to, as you suggested earlier, have been released from that prison which actually did incarcerate him for some 2.5 years and prevent him from carrying out what many of us believe would be his instinct in terms of foreign policy. After all, he was elected on a mandate of ending foreign wars, of non-intervention and so on. He hasn't stuck to that totally, but let's remember that regardless of whatever happens with Donald Trump, up to now, and he's most of the way through his presidency's first term, he hasn't actually started any new wars. And that, again, for this year to have passed, okay, there's still some time left in terms of hours before it passes. But you never know with Donald Trump and Twitter and what might be announced in the hours ahead. But so far this year, he has stuck to that in terms of foreign policy issues, the core mandated message, which was to reduce America's involvement in overseas wars. And think about the number of hundreds of thousands of lives that have been saved, as well as in people like the view of myself, the true interests of American people being represented in not having these wars constantly undertaken. Of course, it isn't necessarily in the interests of the military-industrial complex and so on, regardless of the fact that actually Donald Trump has still massively increased, of course, the defense budget. But moving on to other areas, you've got also a situation where I think in this year we've seen very much America in the early stages under John Bolton. Of course, remember he was appointed as the National Security Advisor, very much a person used as the attack dog by Trump in his negotiation strategy, but who overreached to the extent that Trump had to sack him in the end. And I think everybody around the world, almost everybody, from liberals almost to many neocons, actually breathed a sigh of relief that actually this person was actually going to be put back into his box, perhaps for another day, even with his advanced age.
Trump managed to get him off Twitter for 2 weeks, which was quite an achievement.
But in terms of where Bolton himself overreached, it also very much for me was a symbol of the way in which, in fact, it demonstrated the extent to which America itself is capable of overreach also. Because for me, 2019, largely through the vehicle of John Bolton, demonstrated the limitations of American power in the modern era. If you look at, for example, you alluded to it earlier, Venezuela, the absolute sheer effort that the US establishment made to overthrow the elected government there, and in terms of putting on sanctions, in terms of creating all sorts of what appear to have been false flag incidents, largely bringing about a humanitarian crisis, or at least that's the way it was reported. Remember, we had aid convoys being stopped going in and so on. And then, of course, it being revealed. It couldn't be hidden in the end. That actually this idea of a popular revolution supporting this US choice for president in a country that hadn't been compliant up to now with US policies totally failed. And I know you said it tongue-in-cheek earlier, but I'm going to correct it for your viewers anyway when you said that, don't forget, the whole world hailed this person, how do you say it? I always call him Guido. But it's Guido, isn't it?
Guido, who knows? Certainly
Guido,
not the Venezuelans.
Not the president of Venezuela, no. But this person, of course, was actually only recognised by a very relatively few countries, for example, the European Union and others. Even then, initially, the European Union, apart from one country, of course, and that country is always Britain, refused to back the American line to say that he was a legitimate president until then their deadline for elections had passed. Again, the idea that the EU should tell another country by when it should hold elections is quite extraordinary, given the electoral history in the EU. Another area, and I'm going to briefly say this, of course, was Iran, where you've got a situation which in many ways is a repeat of the Venezuelan situation, where you have the most crippling sanctions being imposed, sanctions that almost as a consensus are hitting not the ruling elite or establishment of Iran, but ordinary people. And people such as myself have long argued that this is a deliberate policy to bring a gap between the people and their government in order to provoke revolution and provoke regime change. And we've seen some success of that. Of course, there are people on the streets demonstrating, but there's nowhere near the momentum needed to actually overthrow a government. And so again there, and also with Iran, where there appear to have been these manufactured incidents in terms of, first of all, the British at American behest seizing a tanker, which provoked a crisis for many weeks. You've got these mysterious mines appearing and explosive charges appearing on these tankers. And again, we saw there that this did not provoke an Iranian response. It did not provoke a war. It did not provoke an aggressive Iranian response, I should mean. In other words, they didn't fall into the trap that was being set for them. And also you saw this growing chasm between the US and the rest of the world. No matter what the media say, it's clear in their voting, it's clear what they say at the UN, it's clear what they're saying. So, for example, you had only the US and the UK, of course, and of course Israel. These were the only people that stated with categoric certainty that it was the Iranians that were guilty of planting these limpet mines on these tankers, despite the fact that no evidence whatsoever was presented by any party for that, and that there were a number of players in that region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, who could have been guilty of that, as indeed could Iran itself have been guilty of it. But you had a complete failure on the part of the European politicians and governments, apart from the UK, to back the US line. And again, you have to suspect that Trump himself, deep in his heart, if he has a heart, which we all know he does, because quite often...
He's got a heart. The question is whether he's got a brain.
Well, exactly. He certainly fires off from some part of his body, that's absolutely sure. And it's really the fact that more and more we're seeing the US, I think, moving away by its actions, not just from those countries that it's outwardly antagonizing like China, but also from its people who would have been its natural allies. Meanwhile, in the background, just to complete this geopolitical picture, you've already covered South America very fully, I think. You've got a situation where other big powers, because it's a shock to Western audiences, but there are other countries in the world outside the West and other areas where you've got countries such as China and Russia continuing to expand and increase, and doing so very quietly and generally very peacefully, expanding their influence and their orbit in the world. And that is largely almost because other countries are looking at them as more reliable partners than the US and Europe, as well as, of course, their increasing geopolitical and economic power. And I don't point to their increasing influence as either a bad thing or a good thing, just as an observed fact. And this is something, of course, that Americans and Europe are continuing to struggle with.
Dr. Tom, let's deal with that latter point that Charles made. As the year comes to an end, China appears to have prevailed over the United States in the trade war. At least the American stock exchange is booming, and Donald Trump is tweeting that an historic deal has been reached with China. Russia is now much more influential in the Arab world than the United States is, no longer seen as a trusted broker. How do you see American influence in the world as we come to the end of 2019?
Well, George, the 21st century was supposed to be the American century.
Yeah.
We're not even 2 decades in, and we already see that's clearly not the case. It's going to be the multipolar century. So yes, I mean, America is still a major power. It will remain a major power for some time to come. Some people say it's a paper tiger. It's an old tiger, but I wouldn't call it paper tiger, at least not yet. But certainly America...
I wouldn't put my hand in its mouth to check.
No, indeed not. But certainly America is only going to be one of a number of countries that's going to play a major role over the coming decades. And I wouldn't even go as far as saying America will even be the biggest country, or rather even play the biggest role. In terms of the trade war between China and America, it was no one's interest, but neither in China's interest nor in America's interest to have a trade war. I mean, both were losing billions. But the thing about Trump is he's a showman at the end of the day. He's a TV star. So he had to say the right things, talk the talk. But when it came to walking the walk, he had to quietly back off. I mean, China also, although things are going well for China, it's not all roses either. I mean, China's economy has been booming in recent years, but that boom is slowing down. If you look at what's happened, for example, I mean, a few years ago, the Chinese economy was booming by about, I think, growing by about 10% a year. Now the current figures predict about 6% growth. So what you've got to remember is China.
I wish we could have that.
Well, yeah, I mean, indeed.
Or half of it.
But the key thing is it's not the growth, it's the rate of growth, and also the trend. The trend is slowing down, and China has to keep expanding. It has to keep. I mean, from a capitalist point of view, it's some products have to go somewhere. It has to sell its products on the global market. So even a decrease in GDP, even a decrease stayed at 6%, which I mean for us would be amazing, but for China it's actually quite worrying. And when you look at it, it's gone down from 10 to 6%. On the point of Russia, you're quite right. Russia and China are continuing to sign more and more trade agreements, security agreements, cultural agreements. You've got quite a powerful partnership going on there, a partnership which other countries like India are looking to join or have started to join. You almost have like a parallel to NATO in a way. You've got a group of countries, which include Russia, China, and other surrounding countries in Central Asia, who are sort of forming their own security bloc. Whereas, on the other hand, in Western Europe, you can see NATO is starting to lose allies. I mean, Turkey is, it's questionable. Turkey's part of NATO, but it's questionable, whether it really is or not, or whether it's just on paper. Trump did say that he wants his European allies, or his vassals, to basically contribute more to NATO. So there's certainly a growing friction between America and other more junior NATO allies. Whereas China and Russia are quietly, peacefully doing their thing, expanding, are being seen as more reliable countries around the world. Just to allude to Syria, thanks to Russia, the coalition involving Russia and Iran, Syria was saved from the hell of jihadism. I mean, Russia, it's also worth, regardless of what the Western press will say, Russia intervened at Syria's request, at the request of the legitimate president. I mean, whereas when the West intervenes, it's never at the request of the leader. And when the West intervenes, the terrorists come afterwards. When Russia and Iran intervened, they got rid of the terrorists.
A very important point. Let's stay with the Arab world for a minute. Omar, you were with the Arabs for Labour in Britain. How do you see the Arab world at the end of 2019?
More of the same. I don't think for 1 minute the agenda in the Middle East, particularly with incoming of a conservative government, which I am sure a lot of Arab leaders or Arab so-called leaders are feeling or breathing a sigh of relief that Jeremy Corbyn isn't number 10, because he has promised that he will stop exporting weaponry to Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Middle East. So in that respect, also Israel is quite comfortable that Jeremy Corbyn isn't in number 10, a man that actually promised that he would recognize the state of Palestine, and he will work to establish a viable solution.
And ban arms sales to Israel.
Ban arms sales, and he also attacked quite openly the president of Turkey. So a lot of countries in the Middle East are feeling comfortable and looking probably forward to 2020 or being a year for expanding their own torture in the Middle East, illegitimate wars, killing children in Yemen, and so on and so forth.
And yet Israel has its own troubles, doesn't it?
Well,
it has no government as we speak.
No, and that's a different worries, not for the whole of the Middle East, but particularly for Israel. It has not been able to function politically for the last 6 months. This is a second, when the election is called, if it hasn't been called yet, there will be another election in Israel that it will be the second one. Yeah, 3 in 1 year, yeah. So 2 in 6 months, I think, yeah. So, I'm not looking forward too much for the 2020 for the Middle East and the Arab countries. There's more torture in Arab countries, as reports have been indicating from different respected worldwide organization. So my intake on this is that it's a little bit bleak for the Middle East.
MBS looks firmly in the saddle when earlier in the year he might have fallen off his horse.
Sorry, I didn't miss that one.
The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia.
Well, the Crown Prince is still. I think he is not going to disappear fast from the scene. It's simply because he has huge support in America, and we know the relationship between America and the Saudis. Without their support, the whole of the kingdom will just fall apart. The role of Iran must always be remembered as well. While I personally see it as being a negative effect, has a negative effect on the Middle East. I see Iran, I see 3 countries, if they actually get together in 2020 and beyond, they can change the whole entire Middle East area, and that is Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. Those 3 countries actually are historically.
Is Egypt still a thing?
Well, let's just talk about Egypt in the future. Let's not talk about it now and the past. If these 3 countries come together in a sort of an agreement, they actually have a huge resources, human resources. 60% of Egyptians, and similarly in Turkey and Iran, are under the age of 30, so you have got a huge amount of manpower and and human resources. Turkey has its own industrial base that can be built. Iran has a huge resources of oil, which can fuel an economic revolution in the area. Egypt also has not only the human resources and also other resources that can enrich the whole area, if only they get together and see what they can do.
If only.
Working together.
If my auntie had a beard, she'd be my uncle.
Yeah, exactly.
More of this after the break. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but reviewing the whole world in 2019. Earlier, we took the كلمة camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
Has 2019 been a year of relative instability or calm?
I'd say relative instability.
I think it's been a year of complete kind of confusion, a lot of political instability.
I think it's been a year of global instability.
Well, probably of instability, I would say, yeah.
Very unstable, very unpredictable.
It's general stability for European countries, for the Americas, and for most parts of the world.
When comparing 2019 to the rest of the decade in terms of global political instability, I'd say that things seem to have calmed down, considering the events of 2014 to 2016 in the Middle East.
Given the last 9 years of Conservative government in this country, How do you see the political landscape developing in Britain in 2020?
Well, I think drawing upon that on a greater scale, in general, right now, in this day and age, I think that politics is becoming more of a joke than anything else. It's kind of like a sitcom which you watch on TV. I mean, from the situation in Brazil, the situation which is happening in Chile, American politics, and now it's becoming British politics. I would say that it's not going to get better for a few more years.
As we can see in the last 9 years, so many issues have accelerated, whether that's homelessness, poverty, education, being more difficult to have access to, questions of foreign policy and involvement in wars and intervention. And so I believe that it is a very kind of scary prospect.
I lived through the 80s, which was quite bad domestically, but I just feel that the prognosis in the coming years could be worse further afield.
To be honest, I don't know. I think it's like a big question mark for everyone.
I'm not very optimistic about what's happening, and I don't think it looks like a rosy future right now.
Given the advocacy for wars and the global arms trade, do you see that trend increasing or decreasing in 2020?
The advocacy, I think it will increase, honestly.
I think it'll stay the same.
I would see the trend in increasing in global arms trade.
To this day, armed conflict and armed trade is one of the most lucrative trades, and I don't see that ending any soon, unfortunately.
It feels like we've not learned many lessons over the last century, and we are making worse and worse mistakes.
Well, not much Christmas cheer there on the streets of London. Let's continue to tour the horizon. Doctor, has Iran played a negative role? I myself find it difficult to see that. And it's true, of course, as Charles Shoebridge said, that the US effort to topple the regime in Iran hasn't gone away, but at the same time, it's looking to me as if it's faltering somewhat. What would you say?
Thank you very much, George, to be back here again.
Welcome.
The situation with Iran, and I just don't want to focus on Iran because I want to talk about a few other things that you've sort of touched. Iran obviously plays a very important role for the last 41 years. In February, it'd be 41 years since the advent of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. It has been a thorn in Washington's, to pardon my French, in their backside for a long time. And that has really colored or tainted the vision of policymakers in Washington, London, and Paris. And really, the reality is that the government, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the whole ethos that he was trying to put forward has not really sort of concurred with the Western hegemonic policies that were in the previous 100 years, and perhaps they wanted it to continue for the next 100 years. So that has been a challenge, and therefore the West has always wanted to topple the government in Tehran. So if you start from that premise, then you can see that 41 years later, it's still continuing on the same sort of trajectory. However, what is different? Of course, the generation that was in 1979 in their 20s, my generation, if you like, they're in their 50s and 60s now. It's their kids who are in their teens and the 20s perhaps didn't see the war that was inflicted on Iran for 8 years. They didn't see the challenges that were faced by the revolution, and perhaps they are looking at Iran from a different angle. But I think what we have to, like my other guest here have said, the Western media always portrays challenges in other countries as though that government is going to be toppled, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's in Hong Kong. And when we talk about France, for the whole year, there have been demonstrations, but really no one talks about it.
No one talks about that, no.
in the same aggressive manner. So you've got to take that with a pinch of salt. Of course, there have been demonstrations and there is corruption in Iran. There are a whole host of other issues. But really the external pressure, the sort of economic pressure that has been piled on Iran, Iran has done remarkably well in the last 41 years, technologically, educationally, sort of sustaining itself economically by internal methods and also trading. I mean, for example, I was talking to someone only yesterday with Afghanistan, for instance, Iran trades $4 billion on an annual basis. Similarly, significantly more with Iraq, Syria, and all the other Middle Eastern countries. So it's not really only the West. Of course, there are certain things that Iran wants to get from the West. So my view, as far as future is concerned, Iran will survive. Not only will it survive, but it will probably thrive because the West is getting challenges from China, from Russia, and the other nations itself. So really, in that sense, the future doesn't look too bad for Iran. However, I just want to move on to what you started with, the British election and what impact it has. I remember very well, and I'm sure you remember it a lot better than I do because you were in the thick of it in politics, in 1983 when Michael Foot was the leader of the party, and he also lost in a huge way. And he said a very nice thing. He said, truth has become a casualty. Not only has truth become a casualty, but it's probably not only dead at this moment because we don't measure our leaders on integrity, on truth, on honesty. We really look at the glamour and the glitter, and that's the pity of it. And when you said that only 1 in 5 people voted for the Conservative, that also is a debate that the democracies that we are talking about in the West, are they really democratic? Are they really representing the people? So it's a bigger discussion that may come in the next decade or so, that how do we evaluate democracy? And I think the fundamental question, which is also very important for us to sort of look at, 2019 was a year, and especially in the last week or so, when Mr. Trump signed his presidential diktat that debate on Israel would be illegal on the campuses in USA.
He reclassified Judaism as a nation and a state, which must have come as quite a surprise to the variety of Jewish people there are in the world, from Chinese Jews to African Jews. Now they're a nation, and you're not therefore allowed to boycott them.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is, the future, that whether it's in Britain, in Europe, or anywhere else, are we going to be allowed to be critical of Israel and its policies?
Well, they won't stop me or you.
Absolutely. We might end up in prison. I don't know.
We're ready. Take us away.
So that, I think, is very, very important to look at, that where are we moving on this debate of anti-Israel, or not supporting Israel, or boycotting Israel, and anti-Semitism. So murking the water and really sort of colouring the debate, saying that if you're critical of what's happening in Tel Aviv with being anti-Semitic, I think is dangerous. It's sort of curtails debate. It sort of muzzles any opinion that people may have.
Yeah.
And that, I think...
But you're only muzzled if you agree to be muzzled.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Let me ask Kevin, sticking to the British, the British issues to which we've now turned. You're now a media, social media, a big star, but you weren't always. How do you look to the Britain that's about to dawn in 2020?
My own story is a history, if anybody doesn't know me, I've overcome addiction and a life of crime, and I've been in British prisons. And part of my story is that while I was in a British prison, I was in for a false charge of robbery. And while I was in there, being held illegally, near Christmas time, on the 30th of December, I got a phone call from my family, and my mother was dying. and she died of cancer. And while I was in that British prison in the middle of London, I was refused to attend her funeral. I said goodbye to my mother on a prison telephone while people were playing pool and arguing over darts, and the telly was blaring. I went to the court, the Guildhall Court, and on the 7th of January 2003, I was asked that there was no charges against me, and the judge has said he was astonished that I had been held in prison for 11 days. While I was in there, my mother died, and I wasn't allowed to attend her funeral, and there was no recompensance, there was no counselling, there was no probation service were involved. So the whole criminal justice system and the safety net that we should have in place for vulnerable people like myself, who was homeless and addicted at the time, weren't available. There's other things that included in my life at that time, 17 years ago, because for 17 years I've been clean, and I've dedicated my life to kind of making life better.
Not going to get easier in 2020 with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, is it?
It hasn't been easy this year, and the cuts regarding services that help people who are addicted and help the homeless have been cut. In some councils, 27%, but in the majority of them, it's like 50%. You know, and I work in the drug field. You know, daily I see vulnerable people, and I'm always champion. They're getting benefit sanctions. They can't pay their rent because they're stopped. These people are terrorised and stressed. That's they are right now. And they come to me, and I get a lot of letter writing, a lot of phone calls, and I go up against a system that doesn't care. It doesn't care. When people are going to these fit for work assessments, this is the cruel and hostile environment I live in today. This exists in our country today. Our prisons are under pressure. They can't cope. They can't deliver rehabilitation. And I predicted that violence will increase. It has done. I predicted that there will be deaths in prison. That will happen. Police are under pressure.
It's a bleak picture.
It's a bleak picture
that you paint, and it's not likely that 2020 is going to be brighter, is it?
I sent an email around a lot of known people who are involved in this. Neil Woods, for example, he's an ex-police officer. He's wrote a book, and he talks about how we need to kind of change our drug policy to a more compassionate and a more regulated view on that.
Well, look, we'll talk about that again, perhaps on another occasion. But as we've got,
I asked them what they think at the same time.
We've got to cover the whole world. Let me ask about Africa.
Yes. Britain, please.
You want to speak about Britain because you're British, but your roots are African.
Definitely.
So speak about Britain and also the situation in Africa.
Thank you very much.
In 2019.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much. You have been presenting this wonderful program, and I wish you a happy New Year.
8 years now.
Definitely. This program is now viewed by lots and lots of people, and I thank you for that. I like to say a few things about Britain and then address the issue of Africa. Sadly, power is shifting from Britain. And power is shifting from Europe. There are emerging new powers, India, China, Brazil, technologically, and in some cases like China, militarily and technologically. What I'm seeing here, the so-called win by a big majority of the conservative, is a work that has been done for somebody. Is a student who has got answers copied and made life easier for him. I believe the Brexit party has done a job for conservative, and there is some secret alliance between the two. And the win for Boris Johnson means what it means for Ireland, Northern Ireland, what it means for Scotland, what it means for Europe, what it means for European nationals in UK, and what it means for the poor people. Briefly, for Northern Ireland, we have seen the Democratic Party unionist Nigel Uddis losing his seat to Sinn Féin. That message means Northern Ireland nationalisation, nationalist mood is coming.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah, and I really, there is nothing wrong. What I mean is that they wanted united Ireland, and the people there are more inclined to work that.
There'll be a united Ireland before the end of Kalimahara's run on television. Take my word for that.
Definitely. So what I wanted to, for Scotland, where if we come, they wanted, the Tories would try to create some kind of, new Irish sea border will be created, and that will alienate the Unionists. And I think it would bring the Unionists against the nationalists, would undermine the Friday Agreement. A lot of things would happen.
You've swallowed the Kool-Aid.
No.
The majority of Unionists voted to remain in the European Union.
Yeah.
There's a very easy way to do that.
Definitely.
Reunite the North and South of Ireland that should never have been divided in the first place.
And, okay, for Africa, I think we have been badly influenced by foreign interventions. I think
the Americans have moved in massively.
Definitely. Americans have taken big bases in Djibouti, and they are implying a policy of limited footprints. They are saying we have got duty to eliminate these Islamic venomous snakes roaming around in the bushes and endangering lives. But the problem we have, for the last 10 years, their engagement produced nothing. Shababs were much more effective, stronger, and there are, I wanted to show the world one thing. For Somalia, for example, the scenario there, they placed a ban on the government that they have established and helped it. They said, no arms sale. And at the same time, they have given the task of going and facing the Shababs, which are well-equipped, highly experienced. And the difficulty is that their engagement have been reduced to just drone attacks. The civilian, victims that are hit and killed and badly injured are denied. The Pentagon always says, we have hit our targets and there are no civilian people who died. So all I wanted to say, Africa is now facing a bigger and more dangerous intervention, especially from the rich Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And also you have got also rivalry between Qatar and Emirates, which is spilling into our regions. There is no country that feels safe and secure. And these countries we know, as you have mentioned, is a petrol station. They have no military capabilities, but somebody is behind using them as a tool to realize their dreams. And
what about China in Africa? What's the impact of China in Africa?
China, there are different opinions. When you look at their Silky Road and the idea of Chinese investing, the Chinese are seen as an opportunity. At the same time, they are seen draining, milking the economies of these countries and putting into debts. That is suspicion. Is a big suspicion over China's involvement. But it is better than nothing. When you compare to the West, the Chinese are actively investing in many parts of the continent. They are building roads, hospitals, schools. They are investing money where the West is just selling weapons.
Yeah, and making bases. Definitely. Let's take some backbenchers. You and then the gentleman in the blue suit. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, my name is Joshua from London, although last month I went to Iran amid the protests. I was fortunate, or well, unfortunate enough to pass riot police on nearby one of its main monuments, the Azadi Tower. So, you kind of get some feel of how pervasive the problem is. But it's quite easy to exaggerate the problem in Iran because for all the, sanctions, which you said, George, were worse than what was levelled against Iraq in some respects, well, they can still, there's no shortage of food there. They have a large agricultural base. There were no power cuts because they have their nuclear power and they also have their hydroelectric power stations. No shortage, it would seem, of consumer goods. It was just there were certain communication issues like not being able to access Google or Facebook, which is why I couldn't post too many updates about anything going on there. Not that I'd want to anyway. But the point is that, the unity of the Islamic Republic of Iran, for all its problems, for all the rioting, and there was quite, even though we didn't see any near our hotel, obviously you could see evidence of it. Because in one case, they shut down throughout most of the trip. They shut down the internet there. Luckily, I want to say this discreetly, but luckily, there were some places that I don't want to say where, but it did actually work. But I'm not saying where, just for the interest of security. In any case, the sanctions have not created a humanitarian crisis in Iran. It's not like it's almost like the Remainers after the EU referendum were predicting that we would have a humanitarian crisis in Britain. We wouldn't be able to import toothpaste and our teeth would rot. But it's nothing like that in Iran. In the sense that people are fed, people are clothed, they have electricity, they have water, and the water is actually safe to drink. The tap water, believe it or not. I even wash my toothbrush in it. So the point is, it's not a humanitarian crisis. It will survive. And though I'm not happy about the suffering it's causing Iranians, it's causing fuel shortages, of course, which has a silver lining in the sense of carbon emissions. Not that I'm trying to patronise any Iranians present. It's not convenient if you're the owner of a car in such a big country. But the point is, Iran will survive. It has survived its war with Iraq. It has survived, the turbulence of the 1990s. It survived the noughties, and didn't do too badly in the noughties with the rise in oil prices. It survived so far through to the end of this decade, and it is here to stay. And
well, that's pretty positive. One last contribution. The gentleman in the blue suit. Yes, sir. Unfortunately, you'll have to be the last talker.
Yes, so I'm from Somalia, so I want to say a little bit about Somalia.
Yeah.
The Somali community living in the UK right now, the situation is not looking positive for us, because 2018, I have been unfairly arrested and I have been in detention for 2 months. So the case has been sorted by the European Union Human Rights Court of Paris. The fact that Europe is now UK is leaving the European Union, the situation is not good. So that's one thing. Secondly, the Somali community who lives in the European Union is millions. A lot of us are in here, and our country has been, caused a lot of issues by the West. So 2020 is not looking great for us.
Okay, but the European Convention on Human Rights, of course, long predates the European Union, and Britain will still be a signatory of the convention, may actually just adopt the European Convention into our law, so that wouldn't actually affect you. James, you were the youngest candidate in the general election, or one of the youngest, and I saw some rave reviews of your performance without going into your own election. Final word to you on how 2019 was, and perhaps more importantly, what you think is going to happen in 2020.
Well, I think 2019 has been a dramatic year, and 2020 looks to be another dramatic year and a year of change. I agree with what you said.
Trust me, when you've seen as many years as me, they're always dramatic years.
But 2020 in the sense that, as you said at the start, Brexit will finally be done, which is the silver lining of the election we've just had. and which will have big implications on the global stage. Whether or not that'll be fully resolved by the end of 2020 remains to be seen. I'm not convinced it will be, and that will be still a few years down the line. But it's a start, and it respects democracy. The concerns,
just for clarification,
yes,
we will have left
absolutely
in January at the end of it.
It's this transition.
But we'll still
period.
be talking about the trading relationship,
of course,
and so on.
That transition.
But we will have left.
Absolutely.
We'll no longer be
Yes.
in the EU,
which is a start.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty good start for me.
Absolutely, after 3 years. It's just whether or not, domestically at least, we can survive another 5 years of more cuts to public services along the lines of things like the criminal justice system, which you spoke about earlier, our education, the health of our country.
Although they have promised that austerity is over, don't you believe them? Don't you believe that, nice Boris Johnson?
Never believe a politician fully, eh?
Thank you, thank you.
Hospitals, I says, what are you going to build them with Lego?
Well, he may or may not build 40 hospitals. He may or may not produce 50,000 nurses. Hope he doesn't interview them personally. It has been a tumultuous year in 2019. You can be sure that on Kaliма and on Al-Mayadeen, we'll be covering everything that matters in 2020. Have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.